Welcome back. Today I was reviewing a script that moved differently from most, not because of what the protagonist destroyed, but because of the order in which he destroyed it. The cold detail that stayed with me: he never filed a single lawsuit. He didn't have to. You're watching His Eternal Diary. She returned my ring at dinner, so I left the country and never answered her calls. The restaurant smelled like truffle oil and someone else's happiness. That's the first thing Ethan Cole registered when he stepped through the glass doors of Aurelius. Not the low amber lighting that turned every face into a Rembrandt painting. Not the murmur of 60 separate conversations folding into a single hum. Not even the way the maitre d' adjusted his posture the moment he recognized the reservation name. It was the smell. Rich, earthen, just slightly overworked. The kind of smell that promised a meal worth remembering for all the wrong reasons. He had made this reservation 6 weeks ago. He had specified the corner table, the one with the banquette that gave a full view of the room without exposing the back. He had ordered the wine in advance, a 2015 Domaine de la Romanée Conti that the sommelier had personally confirmed was the last bottle in the cellar. He had coordinated with the kitchen on the tasting menu, removing the scallop course because Nadia had developed a mild shellfish sensitivity 2 years ago that she mentioned exactly once and probably assumed he had forgotten. He had not forgotten. Ethan Cole did not forget things. It was both his greatest professional asset and the quiet curse that ran beneath everything he touched. He was 34. In the world of corporate restructuring and financial forensics, that made him either a prodigy or a threat, depending on whose office you were sitting in. He wore a charcoal Brioni suit that he had owned for 3 years and maintained with the same methodical attention he gave everything. Dry cleaned on a schedule, never bagged with the plastic on, always hung by the seam. His cufflinks were his grandfather's, not because they were expensive, which they weren't, but because they were the only thing the old man had left him, and Ethan had decided long ago that the objects you chose to carry said more about you than any resume ever could. He was not a man who displayed emotion in rooms that didn't belong to him. He was not a man who let his face do the work that his mind should do. He sat down at the corner table, ordered a glass of still water, checked his phone once, no messages from Nadia, and then placed the phone face down on the white linen tablecloth and looked at the room. 60 people, maybe 62. 3 tables celebrating birthdays, judging by the discreet candle arrangements the servers were staging near the kitchen pass. 1 couple arguing in the refined, tight-lipped way that meant the argument had been going on for weeks, and this dinner had been their last attempt at pretending. 1 man sitting alone at the bar, nursing a scotch with the careful attention of someone who was waiting for something he wasn't sure was coming. Ethan understood that man. The ring was in his jacket pocket, not in a box. He had decided against the box 3 days ago because Nadia always said that boxes felt like theater, and he had wanted this to feel like a conversation rather than a performance. The ring itself was a cushion-cut diamond set in a thin platinum band, 2.4 carats, VS1 clarity, sourced from an estate sale in Antwerp rather than a jeweler, because he had done the research and understood that the secondary market for exceptional stones was always more interesting than what a midtown boutique would show you from behind glass. He had paid $42,000 for it, and considered it a fair price for a thing meant to last a lifetime. He had also, in the 6 weeks between purchasing the ring and this dinner, quietly completed a full financial restructuring of the joint account he and Nadia shared for household expenses. Not because he was suspicious, because Ethan Cole always had a contingency. It was a professional habit that had calcified into a personal one. In his world, the world of distressed asset acquisition, corporate autopsies, and the quiet dismantling of companies that had gotten too comfortable with their own mythology, you never walked into a room without knowing at least 3 ways to walk out of it. You never signed your name to a document without reading the clause that came after the clause that came after the last page. You never made a promise without understanding, with total clarity, what it would cost you if the other party chose not to keep theirs. He had applied none of this calculus to Nadia. That, he would later understand, was the only real mistake he had ever made. She arrived 12 minutes late. Not fashionably late. Nadia Voss did not believe in fashionable lateness, had always considered it a small and unnecessary cruelty. 12 minutes meant something had complicated her departure. Her coat was slightly damp at the shoulders from rain he hadn't noticed starting, which meant she had walked at least 2 blocks from wherever she had been, and the walk had been fast enough to leave a flush along her collarbone that hadn't fully faded by the time she sat down across from him. She was 31 and beautiful in the specific way of women who had grown up being told they were beautiful so frequently that the information had become background noise to them. Present, but unremarkable. Her hair was dark, worn up in a twist that was slightly imprecise, 2 small strands loose at her neck. Her dress was the deep green one he liked, the one she wore when she wanted to feel confident. Gold earrings. The small ones, not the ones her mother had given her that she wore when she was performing. "Sorry," she said, sitting down and adjusting the napkin across her lap in one smooth motion. "The rain came out of nowhere." "It's fine," Ethan said. She looked at the wine already open on the table, and something moved across her face, a flicker of something he couldn't quite name, which was unusual, because he could almost always name the things that moved across Nadia's face. He had been studying her expressions for 4 years with the same methodical attention he brought to quarterly earnings reports and breach of fiduciary duty depositions. "You ordered the good wine," she said. "I ordered the last bottle they had." She looked at him then, really looked at him. And he watched her understand in that moment that this was not a casual dinner, that he had been planning this, that the corner table and the prearranged tasting menu and the last bottle of the most expensive wine in the cellar were not gestures of romantic spontaneity, but the architecture of intention. "Ethan," she said. "Let's eat first," he said. She picked up her menu. He watched her read it without reading it, the way people hold menus when what they actually need is something to do with their hands. The first course came, a thin slice of duck confit over a smear of fig puree, garnished with microgreens that cost the restaurant approximately $3 per gram, and tasted to Ethan like the idea of freshness, rather than freshness itself. He ate it without complaint. Nadia moved hers around the plate and drank half her wine in the first 10 minutes, which was not like her. They talked. About ordinary things. The way people talk when they are both waiting for the conversation that is actually going to happen. She mentioned a project at work. She was an interior architect, had built a quiet but respected practice designing residential and small commercial spaces in the city that had hit a material sourcing delay. He mentioned a client meeting that had run long. They discussed, briefly and without much warmth, whether they needed to replace the hot water heater in the apartment they had shared for 14 months, which had been making a sound for 3 weeks that Ethan had logged in his phone as concerning metallic resonance not yet urgent. By the third course, a slow braised short rib with a bone marrow jus that was genuinely excellent, and that Ethan ate with complete attention, because he had learned long ago that even in the worst moments, a man should eat well if the food deserves it. He became certain. Not that she had been unfaithful. He had already been certain of that for 11 days. He became certain that she was going to tell him tonight. He could see it in the way she held her fork. Slightly too tight. The knuckle of her index finger whitened. He could see it in the way she had twice checked her phone under the table with a motion she thought was invisible. He could see it in the deliberate way she had positioned herself in the conversation, keeping it surface level, keeping it domestic and administrative, staying away from anything that required her to look at him directly for more than a few seconds at a time. She was building up to something. He reached into his jacket pocket and felt the ring, warm from being against his body for 2 hours. He did not take it out. He waited. The fourth course arrived. The sommelier came to pour the second half of the bottle with the ceremony it deserved. Nadia put her hand over her glass. "I'm fine," she said. "I'll stick with water." Ethan watched the sommelier back away, and then looked at Nadia across the table and said nothing, and waited, because he had found over the years that silence was the most efficient extractor of truth in any room. She lasted 40 seconds. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Okay," he said. Her hands were flat on the table now. She had positioned them that way deliberately. He recognized it as a self-calming gesture she had developed sometime in the last 2 years, something she did when she needed to feel grounded. He had noticed it first during a difficult phone call with her father. He had never mentioned it to her. "I've been seeing someone," she said. The restaurant continued around them. Someone laughed at a table near the window, a short, sharp laugh, the kind that comes out surprised. A server passed with a dessert cart that smelled like caramelized sugar and vanilla. "For how long?" Ethan said. Not a question, a request for data. 7 months, she said. He let that number sit in the air between them. 7 months. He and Nadia had been engaged for 9. She had been seeing someone else for 7 of those 9 months. He ran the arithmetic without meaning to, the way he always processed information. Automatically, involuntarily, the numbers arranging themselves into patterns before he had consciously decided to look for them. "Who?" he said. She hesitated, just slightly, not long enough for most people to notice. "Marcus," she said. And there it was. Marcus Hale. Managing partner at Hale Brennan Capital, 51 years old, divorced. 2 adult children from his first marriage, and a reputation in the industry that Ethan had always considered simultaneously impressive and slightly constructed. The kind of reputation that required active maintenance rather than simply existing as a byproduct of genuine achievement. Marcus Hale, who had introduced Ethan and Nadia at a firm dinner 3.5 years ago. Marcus Hale, who had been Ethan's professional mentor for 6 years, who had brought him into his first major restructuring deal at 28, who had personally vouched for him at 3 separate institutional reviews that had shaped the trajectory of his career. Marcus Hale, who had been texting Nadia from a secondary phone number that Ethan had identified 11 days ago, when a routing audit on a shared telecommunications account, a small forensic habit he maintained on all his accounts, not out of suspicion, but out of the same professional instinct that made him read footnotes and audit subsidiary ledgers, had surfaced a pattern of outgoing calls that didn't align with the contact list he knew. He had not confronted her. He had not confronted Marcus. He had simply waited and continued working. And on the 4th day after the discovery he had made, a series of phone calls and sent a series of emails that collectively constituted the first movements of a strategy that he had not yet fully articulated, even to himself, but that his instincts, which he trusted above almost everything, told him was the correct approach. "Okay," he said. Nadia looked at him. "Okay? You said you needed to tell me something. You've told me." "Ethan," her voice had dropped. "I'm sorry. I know how inadequate that is. I didn't plan for this to—" "You don't need to explain the mechanism," he said. "I understand the mechanism." She reached into her small clutch and placed something on the table between them. The ring. Not his ring. He still had his ring, still warm against his ribs in his jacket pocket. Her ring. The one he had given her 9 months ago. the 2.4-carat cushion cut in the thin platinum band that had come from an estate sale in Antwerp. She had placed it on the white tablecloth between them, and in the low amber light of Aurelius, it caught the light in the particular way of very good diamonds. Not flashy, not performative, just a quiet internal illumination, as if the stone itself was indifferent to the drama surrounding it. He looked at it for 3 seconds. He picked it up and put it back in his jacket pocket next to the other ring, the one he had never taken out. "Okay," he said again. "Please say something else," she said quietly. He looked at her. He looked at the green dress he liked, and the gold earrings that were the small ones, and the 2 loose strands of dark hair at her neck, and he thought, with a clarity that surprised him even now, about how long he had known her, and how completely he had been wrong about what knowing her meant. "I hope the short rib was as good for you as it was for me," he said. He placed his napkin beside his plate. He stood up. He took his wallet from his inner pocket and removed the black card and placed it on the table without looking at the bill. The dinner would be somewhere between $400 and $500, a rounding error, and he buttoned his jacket and looked at the room once, the way he always looked at a room before leaving it, cataloging the exits and the positions of people and the general architecture of the space. Then he looked at Nadia one more time. She was sitting very still. Her eyes were bright but dry. Her hands were flat on the table again, both of them, the self-calming gesture. "Ethan," she said, "what are you going to do?" He thought about that question for a moment. It was a reasonable question. It deserved something. "I'm going to finish what I started," he said. He walked out of Aurelius into the rain. He did not go home that night. He went to his office instead, the private office he maintained on the 14th floor of a building on Park Avenue South, separate from the firm, which he used for personal forensic work and strategic planning that he preferred to keep outside the institutional record. The building had a 24-hour security desk and a coffee machine in the lobby that dispensed something that was technically coffee in the same way that gas station sushi was technically food. He poured a cup, held it, never drank it, and rode the elevator up to 14. The office was sparse by design. A desk, 2 chairs, a whiteboard that he kept cleared unless he was actively working a problem, a filing cabinet with a biometric lock, and a window that looked directly at the steel and glass back of the building across the alley. No view, by choice, because views were distractions, and he had never found a view that improved his thinking. He sat down. He did not allow himself to feel the thing that was moving through his chest like a current. He noted it, catalogued it the way a diagnostician notes a symptom without immediately treating it, and then he set it aside, because feeling it right now would cost him time he did not have and clarity he needed. 4 years. He had spent 4 years building a life with Nadia Voss. Not dramatically, not publicly. Ethan Cole did not do things dramatically or publicly. He had built it the way he built everything, methodically, with attention to the load-bearing structures, with a clear-eyed understanding of both what he was putting in and what he was getting back. He had reorganized his apartment, his schedule, his social architecture, his professional priorities, his long-term financial planning, all of it reorganized around the gravitational center of a life shared with one specific person. And Marcus. He let himself think about Marcus for exactly 3 minutes. 51 years old, 6 years of mentorship, 3 career-defining endorsements, the handshake at the firm dinner where he had said, "Nadia Voss, I want you to meet someone who is going to be very important." And at the time, Ethan had thought Marcus was talking about himself and had been privately amused by the vanity of it. He had not understood, until now, the specific category of cruelty in that introduction. After 3 minutes, he stopped thinking about Marcus. He opened his laptop. The first thing he pulled up was not a document about Marcus or Nadia. It was the shell company he had incorporated in Delaware 17 years ago, at the age of 17, because he had read a book about asset protection when he was 16, and had decided it was better to have the structure and not need it than to need the structure and not have it. The company had sat dormant for a decade, maintained with the minimum annual fees, never activated, never dissolved. He activated it now. Then he opened a second window and pulled up the folder he had labeled, with the dry humor that lived entirely inside his own head, Contingency Plan A. He had started building it 11 days ago, the day after he had identified the secondary phone number. It was not a plan for revenge. Ethan Cole did not use that word because it implied emotional motivation, and he had never found emotional motivation to be a reliable fuel for anything that required precision. It was a plan for correction. He had learned financial forensics at 26, during the 18 months he had spent embedded with a forensic accounting firm in London after finishing law school. He had not planned to become a forensic specialist. He had planned to be a pure corporate lawyer, the kind who built complex deal structures with the elegance of an architect. But the London secondment had introduced him to a world of financial archaeology that he had found, to his own surprise, more compelling than anything in his previous professional experience. Financial forensics was, at its core, the practice of reading the hidden language of money. Every transaction left a trace. Every transfer, every purchase, every restructuring and reallocation and quiet movement of capital through the labyrinthine architecture of modern finance, all of it, left marks, the way a heavy object leaves a depression in carpet long after it's been removed. The job was to find those marks, to read them, to reconstruct from their pattern the story that someone had worked very hard to make invisible. Ethan had discovered, in London, that he was exceptionally good at this. Better than exceptional. His supervisor during the secondment, a Scottish woman named Fiona, who had the affect of an accountant but the instincts of a bloodhound, had told him at the end of his placement that she had worked with perhaps a dozen people in 20 years who had his particular combination of legal training and forensic intuition, and that all of them had either gone very far or very wrong, and that she genuinely could not predict which it would be for him. He had gone very far by almost any measure. He had also, in the last 11 days, begun applying the full weight of those skills to the financial architecture of one Marcus Hale. Not illegally. This point was important to Ethan, not as a moral constraint exactly, but as a strategic one. Illegal action created exposure, and exposure created leverage for the other party, and Ethan had no interest in handing Marcus Hale a weapon. Everything he had done, everything he was going to do, would be entirely, impeccably, even boringly legal. That was, in its own way, the most frightening version of the thing. The first call came from Nadia at 11:47 p.m. He watched his phone vibrate on the desk. Her name, her photo, one he had taken in Lisbon 18 months ago. She was laughing at something off camera, her head tilted back, the afternoon light coming through the window of a cafe and turning her into something that looked painted. The name and the photo sat on the screen for 6 rings and then went to voicemail. He did not listen to the voicemail. He made a note in his phone, 11:47 p.m., call 1. He was going to document everything, not because he needed the documentation legally, he almost certainly did not, but because documentation was the habit of a man who never assumed he wouldn't need it, and also because the act of documenting, of reducing events to their bare factual components, was one of the ways he managed the current in his chest that he still had not allowed himself to fully feel. He worked until 3 in the morning. Then he went to a hotel, the kind of mid-range hotel with decent blackout curtains and no minibar to tempt him into decisions he'd regret in the morning. Checked in under his corporate card, took a shower, and lay down on a bed that smelled of industrial detergent and something faintly floral, and stared at the ceiling. He thought about what he was going to do. Not the strategy was largely built. He thought about the shape of it. He thought about the sequence. He thought about the 11 specific vulnerabilities he had identified in Marcus Hale's financial architecture over the last 11 days. The way a surgeon thinks about an operating schedule, not with excitement, not with dread, but with the clean, precise attention of someone who understands that the difference between a good outcome and a catastrophic one is almost always a matter of sequence. He fell asleep at 4:15 a.m. with his phone on the nightstand. Nadia had called 4 more times. He had documented all of them. In the morning, he made 2 calls. The first was to his assistant, a 26-year-old named Patrick, who was relentlessly competent and asked almost no personal questions, which was one of the primary reasons Ethan had hired him. He asked Patrick to arrange indefinite coverage of his existing client commitments, citing a personal matter requiring extended travel, and to contact building management about his apartment with instructions that he would be vacating within 30 days. Patrick said, "Of course," and asked no follow-up questions, which confirmed, once again, that he had hired the right person. The second call was to a travel agency he had used twice before for last-minute international arrangements. He booked a one-way business-class ticket to Singapore, departing in 31 hours. Not because Singapore was part of the plan specifically. Singapore was the opening move. Singapore was where he needed to be for the first conversation. The one that would begin the sequence. The one that would require him to be in the same time zone as a man named Philip Osei, who was the Southeast Asia director of a private equity fund called Meridian Growth Partners, and who was one of 3 people currently positioned to make a specific acquisition decision that Marcus Hale needed to go a specific way. Ethan had met Philip Osei once at a conference in Geneva 4 years ago. They had spoken for 40 minutes over dinner and had disagreed productively about the regulatory environment for cross-border SPACs. And at the end of the conversation, Philip had said, "Call me if you ever have something interesting," and given him a card that Ethan had filed in the contacts section of his phone under P. Osei, M-E-R. He had never called. He was going to call now. The 31 hours before the flight were the administrative hours. He moved with the efficiency of a man who had, on some level, always been prepared for exactly this kind of rapid reorganization. He had lived relatively lightly for someone of his means. His apartment was well appointed, but not full of the accumulated weight of a deeply domestic existence. He had always maintained, almost unconsciously, a kind of strategic portability. Good luggage, passports, plural, a second one through a legitimate citizenship by investment program in Malta that he had completed 3 years ago for reasons that had seemed abstract at the time and now felt like providence. A network of professional relationships distributed across enough geographic nodes that he could be functional and credible in a dozen different cities within 48 hours of arriving. He had, it turned out, built a life that was very good at being picked up and moved. He spent 4 hours at his Park Avenue South office, finalizing the initial documents set for what he was internally calling the correction. He transferred the documentation to an encrypted drive and a secure cloud folder, and then printed a hard copy, which he placed in the biometrically locked filing cabinet alongside everything else he kept there. The contingency plans, the asset lists, the carefully maintained archive of decisions that he was never going to need and always needed to have. Then he went back to the apartment for the last time. It was a good apartment. 14 floors above the street, southern exposure, a kitchen he had renovated 2 years ago with the kind of quiet, obsessive attention to material quality that he applied to everything. Cast iron pan he had seasoned himself, knives from a small manufacturer in Lyon. A coffee setup that had taken 6 months to calibrate to the exact extraction time and temperature that produced the result he was looking for. Nadia's things were everywhere. Not the enormous, intimate way of someone who had fully moved in. She had kept her own place. They had discussed eventually selling both and getting something together. A conversation that had been ongoing for 8 months without resolution. But the distributed, organic way of someone who had been present in a space often enough to leave traces. A plant on the windowsill she had brought over 6 months ago, and that he had been watering every 3 days. A book on the coffee table, a monograph on a Brazilian architect she was researching for a project. 2 mugs she had bought at a market in Marrakesh, the ones with the cobalt blue rim, that she preferred to his. He stood in the living room for exactly 90 seconds. Then he packed 2 bags, one hard-sided case and one carry-on, with the precise efficiency of a man who had packed for extended travel many times and knew exactly what he needed and what he could acquire wherever he was going. And he walked out of the apartment and did not look back at the plant on the windowsill, or the book on the coffee table, or the mugs with the cobalt blue rim. He was not performing coldness. He was simply moving forward on the only timeline that made sense to him now. The one that began with the ring on the tablecloth and ended somewhere he couldn't fully see yet, but could feel. The way you can feel the shape of a room in the dark before your eyes adjust. His phone rang in the taxi to the hotel where he was spending his last night in the city. Nadia, for the 7th time. He watched the name on the screen. He thought about Lisbon, the cafe, the afternoon light, the laugh. He pressed decline. Call 7, he noted. 2:14 p.m. He landed in Singapore at 11:30 p.m. local time, 40 hours after walking out of Aurelius. Changi Airport, even at that hour, had the specific quality that Ethan had noticed on his 2 previous visits, a kind of performative cleanliness, a choreographed efficiency that was simultaneously impressive and slightly alienating, as if the entire facility existed to demonstrate that disorder was a choice rather than an inevitability. He cleared customs with his Maltese passport, retrieved his luggage from a carousel that delivered it within 4 minutes of arrival, and took a taxi to a hotel in the Marina Bay area that he had stayed in once before and found adequately comfortable without being the kind of place where you started feeling at home. He did not want to feel at home anywhere for a while. He slept for 7 hours. He woke up at 6 a.m., brewed a cup of the hotel's coffee, which was, as expected, technically coffee and nothing more, stood at the window and looked at the bay, which was the color of pewter in the early light, container ships moving across it with the unhurried certainty of objects too large to be rushed. He called Philip Osei at 8 a.m. "Ethan Cole," Philip said on the 3rd ring, in the tone of a man who kept meticulous mental records of every professional contact he had ever made, and was currently accessing the file. "It's been 4 years? Geneva." 4 years and 3 months, Ethan said. "I told you I'd call when I had something interesting." A pause. "I'm listening." What followed was a conversation that lasted 47 minutes and covered, in careful, precise language, the situation at Hale Brennan Capital. Specifically, it covered the $340 million acquisition that Marcus Hale was currently structuring, a leveraged buyout of a mid-market logistics company called Vertex North, and the specific way in which the deal's funding structure relied on an $85 million co-investment commitment from Meridian Growth Partners that had not yet been formally executed. Ethan had known about the Vertex North deal for 8 months. He had known about it because Marcus had, 6 months ago, brought him in on a preliminary legal review of the target company's corporate structure, a review that Ethan had completed and delivered and been paid for, and that had given him, as a natural byproduct of the work, a thorough understanding of both the deal's architecture and its dependencies, including its dependency on the Meridian co-investment. He laid out, for Philip Osei, a series of observations about the target company's financial statements that the standard due diligence process had either missed or minimized. Not fabricated concerns, real ones. Ones that Ethan had noticed during his 8-month-old review and had, at the time, flagged in the appropriate places within the appropriate documents, and then moved on from, because his job had been limited to the corporate structure and not the broader investment thesis. He had moved on from them 8 months ago. He was not moving on from them now. If the receivables aging schedule is what you're describing, Philip said after a long silence, the effective EBITDA multiple is about 2 full turns higher than what the deck presents. At minimum, Ethan said, and there's a concentration risk in the top 2 customers that the deal memo addresses in a footnote that I'd characterize as optimistic. Another pause, longer this time. How did you come to have this level of familiarity with the deal? Legal review, 8 months ago. I'm not under an NDA. The engagement was concluded and released. Philip Osei was a careful man. Ethan had understood this in Geneva and was counting on it now. A careful man, when presented with specific documentable concerns about a deal he had not yet formally committed to, did not dismiss those concerns. He investigated them. I'll need to look at this more carefully, Philip said. Of course, Ethan said. Take your time. He had, of course, already emailed Philip a 22-page memorandum before making the call, organized with the methodical clarity of a forensic review rather than an advocacy document. Just facts, just numbers, just the pattern of the marks that the heavy object had left in the carpet. He hung up. He sat for a moment in the hotel chair, looking at the ceiling. The air conditioning made a low, constant sound. Not unpleasant, just present, the white noise of a machine doing its job. He had always found that sound clarifying. It was the sound of a room that was not pretending to be anything other than functional, and he found functionality, in the current moment, deeply reassuring. He thought about what he had just done. Not whether it was right. He had already resolved the question of rightness to his own satisfaction, which was the only tribunal that mattered to him in this particular matter. What he thought about was whether it was sufficient. Whether one conversation with one fund director, however carefully structured and honestly reported, was the correct first move, or whether he was underestimating the resilience of Marcus Hale's professional network, the thick, interlocking web of relationships and obligations and mutual dependencies that a man built over 30 years in a relationship-intensive industry. Marcus Hale was not an isolated operator. He had allies, advisors, co-investors who had done well alongside him, institutional relationships that had been maintained through a succession of market cycles and deal environments that would have broken less durable partnerships. He had, on any fair accounting, built something real. The reputation that Ethan had privately considered slightly constructed was constructed, yes, but it had been constructed on a foundation of genuine deal performance and genuine relationship management. And those things did not dissolve overnight because a single co-investor had gotten cold feet about a single transaction. Which was why one thread was not enough. Which was why the correction required 3 threads, running simultaneously, each one technically independent but collectively creating a compound pressure that no single defense could address. Because a man defending on 3 fronts simultaneously, none of which was obviously connected to the others, faced a categorically different problem than a man defending against a single attack. A single attack could be contained and countered. 3 simultaneous, independent, legitimately grounded challenges in different legal domains, each requiring separate counsel and separate documentation and separate strategic responses, created the specific kind of systemic drag that was the financial and operational equivalent of trying to keep 3 fires from spreading at the same time with a single bucket. He had learned this in London, not from any single engagement, but from the accumulated pattern of the 18 months he had spent taking apart companies that had gotten into trouble, and the consistent observation that the companies that had failed most completely had not failed because of one catastrophic error, but because of 3 or 4 moderate errors that had occurred simultaneously and created a resource allocation problem that the company's leadership could not solve within the available time and capital. The same principle applied to individuals. He ordered room service, eggs, toast, fresh fruit, a pot of actual good coffee that the restaurant on level 32 produced at a quality that justified the price, and ate at the desk by the window while looking at his next document. The second thread of the correction ran through corporate law. Specifically, it ran through a provision in Hale Brennan Capital's limited partnership agreement that Marcus Hale had drafted 8 years ago with a boutique fund formation firm that no longer existed. Ethan had reviewed this agreement as part of his early work with the firm, years before he had any reason to look for problems in it, and he had at the time noted, in the margin of his personal copy, in pencil, the way he noted everything he found interesting, that Section 8.4c contained a conflict of interest disclosure requirement with an unusually broad definition of related party. Under Section 8.4c, a related party was defined as any person with whom a managing partner maintained a personal or familial relationship reasonably expected to create a conflict between the interests of such person and the fund. Standard enough in form. In practice, what this meant was that Marcus Hale was required to disclose to the fund's limited partners any personal relationship that could plausibly create a conflict of interest. Nadia Voss was not, in any direct sense, a conflict of interest. She was an interior architect with no financial stake in any of Hale Brennan's portfolio companies. But Marcus had, at some point in the last several months, begun providing capital to support Nadia's firm. Specifically, a $400,000 line of credit extended through a holding company that was 2 entities removed from Marcus's personal balance sheet. Ethan had found this 14 days ago, not through any special access to Marcus's financials, but through the public record of a UCC filing in New York State that any person could access by knowing where to look. $400,000 to Nadia's firm, through a structure designed to obscure the source. Now, was this a conflict of interest with Hale Brennan's fund operations? Probably not, in any direct sense. But was it a non-disclosed personal relationship under the aggressive reading of Section 8.4c that a sufficiently motivated limited partner attorney might pursue? Potentially. And potentially, in the fund governance world, was enough to require an investigation. And investigations cost time. And time, for a managing partner in the middle of a $340 million leveraged buyout that required co-investor confidence, was a resource Marcus Hale could not afford to lose. Ethan drafted a carefully worded letter. Not an accusation, not a complaint, but a request for clarification from what appeared to be a small secondary limited partner in one of Hale Brennan's earlier fund vintages. A limited partner who, as it happened, had assigned their interest in that fund 18 months ago to a vehicle that Ethan's dormant Delaware company had quietly acquired for approximately $40,000. $40,000. For a 0.3% interest in a 10-year-old fund that had already returned most of its capital and currently held a handful of residual positions. A nearly worthless position by conventional measure, except that a 0.3% interest was a limited partner interest. And a limited partner interest came with certain information rights and, in certain circumstances, certain standing to request clarification on Section 8.4c matters. He had located the assignable interest through a secondary market database he maintained a subscription to, a niche institutional service that tracked limited partner positions available for transfer in closed-end private funds. The position had been sitting there for 14 months, listed by a small family office that had decided the administrative burden of holding a residual interest in a nearly wound-down fund exceeded any remaining economic value. Ethan had paid 3 times the listed asking price to close the transaction quickly and without negotiation, and the family office had signed the assignment agreement within 48 hours, clearly surprised and not inclined to ask questions. The letter itself was 3 paragraphs, factual, specific, entirely devoid of accusation. It invoked the partnership agreement section by number, described the UCC filing and the financial relationship in language taken directly from the public record, and asked, with the measured courtesy of a party exercising a contractual right, for written confirmation of how the disclosure question had been evaluated. The fund's counsel, upon receiving it, would immediately bring it to Marcus. Marcus would read it in 30 seconds and understand exactly what it meant, not legally, not provably, but with the specific, deep certainty of a man who had done something wrong to someone he had underestimated, and who was now discovering the precise dimensions of that underestimation. That understanding was a cost Ethan had not designed into the plan as a goal. It was simply a byproduct. He noted it and moved on. He sent the letter. The third thread took longer to pull. Estate law was not Ethan's primary specialty, but he had a working knowledge of it, and more importantly, he had a professional relationship with a woman named Clara Whitmore, who was widely considered one of the 3 best estate litigation attorneys in New York, and who owed Ethan a favor that was approximately 4 years old, and that she had told him, at the time, she expected to repay at a commensurate level of seriousness. He called Clara from Singapore at 9 p.m. local time, which was 9 a.m. New York, and she picked up on the second ring. "Ethan, I heard you left the country." The speed of information in professional networks never stopped being mildly impressive. "I did." "Personal reasons?" She asked it with the precise neutrality of a lawyer who knew how to ask a question that was really a different question. "Professional ones," he said. "I need to talk to you about an estate matter, specifically about the estate of a Mr. Harold Hale." A beat of silence. "As in Marcus Hale's father?" "Who passed away 14 months ago, yes, and whose estate, as I understand it, included a 22% stake in a light manufacturing company called Reston Industrial, which was transferred to Marcus as the sole heir under Harold Hale's will." "Reston Industrial," Clara said slowly. "That's a closely held company." "Correct. Currently sitting on real property that has been assessed at approximately $12 million, but that, if you reviewed the most recent county assessor records along with 3 comparable commercial sales within a 2-mile radius in the last 18 months, appears to be carrying a book value approximately $7 million below what an arm's-length sale would produce." He could hear Clara writing. She had the habit of writing on physical paper, yellow legal pads, always, even when she could type faster. "The estate has been closed?" she asked. 14 months ago. But there was a co-beneficiary. Harold Hale had a sister, Margaret, currently 73, living in Connecticut. She was originally named in a 2009 version of Harold's will as a secondary beneficiary with a 15% interest in the residual estate. The 2019 revision removed that bequest. And she signed off on the probate. She signed off on the probate. But the estate attorney at the time was a solo practitioner who has since retired, and the question of whether Margaret Hale was adequately advised about the real property valuation, specifically whether she was given access to independent appraisal evidence before agreeing to the distribution, is a question that, in my view, has not been fully examined. Clara was quiet for a moment. "You want me to reach out to Margaret?" "I want you to do whatever you would do," Ethan said, "if a 73-year-old woman came to your office and asked you whether her brother's estate had been handled correctly." And if she hasn't come to my office? She might, if she received a letter explaining that estate litigation attorneys routinely conduct complimentary consultations for potential beneficiaries who have questions about a distribution. Another pause. Longer. Is Margaret aware of any of this? Margaret is a 73-year-old retired music teacher in Connecticut who received a sympathy card when her brother died and has spoken to Marcus Hale exactly twice since the estate was closed. I have no reason to believe she is aware of the valuation question. But you are. I reviewed the assessor records last week, Ethan said. They're public documents. Clara made a sound that was not quite a laugh. You know, she said, when you called in that favor, I assumed it would be something like getting a quick review of a contract. I know, Ethan said. This is more interesting. It's going to take time. I have time, he said. I'm not in a hurry. This was not entirely true. He was, on one specific timeline, very much in a hurry. But on the timeline that mattered for this particular thread, the slow, procedural, documentary timeline of estate law, patience was not just a virtue, but a weapon. He thanked Clara, hung up, and looked out at the bay. It was dark now. The container ships were lit up, moving across the black water like slow, deliberate thoughts. He watched them for a while, thinking about sequence and timing, and the particular satisfaction of a plan that did not require anyone to break anything. He had not yet called back. Not Nadia. Not Marcus. His phone showed at this point 14 missed calls from Nadia and 2 from Marcus. He had logged every one. Marcus's calls had come, he noted, within 90 minutes of each other, which suggested a specific kind of panic, the kind that came from someone who had just learned that the other party was not going to perform the expected emotional scene, but was instead doing something else, something quieter, and therefore more alarming. He opened his email and sent one message. It went to his building manager and concerned the apartment. Then he opened the contact file for a real estate attorney in New York named Jerome Pacheco and scheduled a call for the following morning. The real estate thread was the simplest and the most immediately satisfying, in the specific way that simple, clean mechanisms tend to be satisfying to a certain kind of mind. Marcus Hale owned, personally, 4 properties in New York. His primary residence, a co-op on the Upper East Side, was mortgaged. 2 investment properties in Brooklyn were unencumbered, and a commercial unit in Tribeca, purchased 8 years ago and leased to a retail tenant on a below-market lease that was coming up for renewal in 4 months, was also unencumbered, but carrying a tax assessment that had not been challenged in 6 years, despite the fact that comparable values in the immediate area had increased approximately 34% in that period. This last detail was interesting for a specific reason. In New York City, a property owner who failed to challenge an overassessment within the applicable period could not retroactively recover the excess taxes paid, but a property owner approaching a lease renewal had every incentive to have the property properly assessed before setting new rental rates, and a proper assessment would naturally produce documentation that could, as a secondary effect, inform a range of other financial conversations about the property's value. Ethan was not going to challenge the assessment himself. He had no standing to do so. It was Marcus's property. But Jerome Pacheco had a practice that included, among other services, a proactive property tax review service for commercial owners, and it was not unusual for Jerome's office to reach out to property owners with unsolicited analyses of their assessment exposure. Jerome, when Ethan called the next morning from Singapore, was happy to take on the engagement. "We've been meaning to expand our commercial review practice," Jerome said. "This feels like a good opportunity," Ethan said. He wired Jerome's retainer, a modest $3,500, from the Delaware entity. The value of this particular thread was not in itself enormous. A corrected assessment might reduce Marcus's property tax by $15,000 to $20,000 a year, and simultaneously produce documentation, independent appraisal reports, comparable sales analyses, that would be useful to the estate litigation attorney in Connecticut when she began building her argument about the real property valuation in Harold Hale's estate. Cross-thread utility. The same piece of information serving two purposes simultaneously. The efficiency of it was not something Ethan consciously sought. It was something that emerged from the natural logic of the plan, the way a good legal argument found its own coherence once you had identified the correct organizing principle. He spent 3 days in Singapore. He ran every morning, 5 miles along the Marina Bay waterfront, in the heavy, close heat that Singapore wore even at 6 a.m., the kind of heat that reminded you the tropics were not metaphorical. He ate well. He slept 7 hours. He worked for approximately 12 hours a day, in a state of focused intensity that he recognized from his best professional periods: the distressed acquisition of a collapsed hotel chain, the forensic reconstruction of a fraudulent fund structure. A state in which the problem before him was interesting enough to make most other things temporarily irrelevant. He thought about Nadia in the spaces between work, in the way that a specific and persistent physical sensation demands acknowledgement, even when you would prefer to set it aside. Not with anger, exactly. Anger required a kind of sustained energy that Ethan found inefficient, and he had stopped investing in it sometime in the first 48 hours after Singapore. What he felt, when he let himself feel it, was closer to the specific and clarifying disappointment of a very careful person who had, on one matter of cardinal importance, been careless. He had trusted the wrong person with the part of himself that was not a lawyer or a forensic analyst or a cold-eyed reader of financial documents. He had trusted it to someone who had accepted that trust, and then quietly built something else alongside it, something that required concealment, and therefore required, at its foundation, a sustained and deliberate dishonesty. 7 months. He ran his 5th mile on, the 3rd morning, and thought, for the first time with any real precision, about what the last 7 months had looked like from the outside. The dinners he and Nadia had had, the weekend in the Hudson Valley in October that she had seemed genuinely happy during. The Thanksgiving with her family, where she had held his hand under the table during a contentious conversation about politics, and he had squeezed back without thinking about it. The automatic reflex of a person who had become accustomed to having someone beside them. All of it, in the background, running alongside the other thing. He finished his run. He stretched on the waterfront, looking at the bay. A cargo ship was moving out toward the Strait of Malacca, heavy in the water, riding low. He checked his phone. 19 missed calls from Nadia, 4 from Marcus, 1 from his building manager confirming the 30-day notice had been received. He put the phone in his pocket and went back to the hotel. He flew from Singapore to London on the 4th day. London was not operationally necessary. The threads he had set in motion did not require his physical presence anywhere in particular. But London was where he had learned to do the work that he was doing, and there was something grounding, he found, about returning to a place where you had become what you were. He took a flat in Notting Hill on a 30-day furnished lease. The building was a Victorian terrace conversion, the flat itself modest by the standards of what he was accustomed to in New York. A sitting room, a bedroom, a kitchen that was small but well-equipped, and a writing desk by the window that looked directly at the back garden of the property behind, where someone had planted a rose hedge that was dormant and bare in the November cold, just a network of thorny stems holding the shape of what it would be in spring. He looked at that hedge a lot. London in November had a particular quality that matched the interior work he was doing. Not darkness exactly, but a reduction. The days were short and the light was flat, and the city moved at a slightly lower temperature in all senses. which suited him. He had always worked better in climates that did not demand anything of you aesthetically, that simply offered themselves as a neutral backdrop and let the foreground be whatever you brought to it. He ran in the mornings, not the waterfront heat of Singapore, but the cold, drizzled quiet of Holland Park, where the paths were wet with fallen leaves that had been rained on so many times they were no longer distinct objects, but a kind of aggregate, a compressed record of autumn in a particular place. He ran 6 miles, sometimes 7, maintaining the pace he had kept since university, the pace that was just uncomfortable enough to be productive, the pace where thinking happened cleanly because the body was occupied enough to stay out of the mind's way. He thought about Marcus during those runs. Specifically, he thought about the architecture of what Marcus had done, not its emotional content, which he had filed and set aside, but its structural logic. A 51-year-old man in a relationship with the fiancé of a protégé was not, in any narrow sense, an irrational act. Men did this. The logic of desire did not respect the architecture of professional obligations, and Ethan had read enough history and enough behavioral finance and enough clinical psychology in the course of a life spent trying to understand why organizations and individuals made the decisions they made to know that there were entire categories of human action that operated largely outside the deliberative systems that people liked to believe governed them. But the concealment, the 7 months of concealment, maintained with sufficient discipline to involve a secondary phone number and a financial arrangement routed through 2 holding entities. That was not the overflow of uncalculated desire. That was managed. That was a man who had looked at what he was doing, calculated the exposure, and decided that the exposure was manageable, which meant that he had looked at Ethan specifically and concluded that Ethan was not, ultimately, a threat he needed to take seriously. He had been wrong about that. Ethan found, on his 3rd run through Holland Park, that the thought produced not anger, but something colder and more clarifying. The recognition that Marcus had made a professional error, a risk assessment error. He had looked at Ethan Cole and seen a skilled technician, a valuable asset, a man who had built his career in part on the foundation of Marcus's endorsement, and who therefore could be assumed to carry a certain loyalty debt that would serve as a deterrent. He had not looked at Ethan Cole as someone who would do what Ethan Cole was currently doing. That misreading, Ethan thought, finishing his 6th mile in the flat gray light of a November morning, was the most interesting thing about the entire situation. Not the betrayal itself, which was comprehensible, even if it was not forgivable. The misreading. The specific failure to understand that the man you had wronged might be precisely the kind of man whose response would be the thing you had least prepared for. He received an update from Philip Osei on the 5th day. Meridian Growth Partners was beginning an independent review of the Vertex North deal, and the formal co-investment commitment would be held pending the review's completion. This had the immediate effect of introducing a timeline problem into Marcus Hale's acquisition structure. The seller had a walk right at day 72 if all financing was not committed, and day 72 was 31 days away. Marcus called 3 times that day. Ethan looked at each call and pressed decline and noted the time. He was not going to speak to Marcus Hale. Not because he was avoiding the confrontation. Ethan Cole did not, as a matter of principle, avoid confrontations, but because there was nothing Marcus could say that was actionable, and there was nothing Ethan wanted to say to Marcus that could be said in a phone call without giving away the structure of what he was doing. Silence, in the current situation, was not a failure of nerve. It was the correct tactical position. On the 7th day in London, he received an email from Clara Whitmore. Subject line, Connecticut. The body of the email was brief, because Clara was a woman who matched her communication style to her environment, and her environment was litigation. Met with the client. She is interested in exploring her options. The valuation question is real. We are proceeding. Ethan read the email twice. He replied with a single word. Good. He then opened a spreadsheet he had been maintaining since Singapore, a timeline document that mapped the current position and projected trajectory of each thread in the correction. He updated the estate thread from initiated to active. He looked at the total picture. 3 threads, all active. 1 creating a financing crisis, 1 creating a governance headache, 1 creating a potential estate litigation that would require Marcus to retain counsel, produce documents, and explain the disposition of a property that was materially undervalued in a distribution that had, at minimum, the appearance of a conflict of interest. None of it was devastating individually. A financing delay could be resolved. A Section 8.4c inquiry could be managed with good fund counsel. An estate litigation claim from a 73-year-old woman in Connecticut could be defended. But all of it, simultaneously, in a 31-day window, for a man in the middle of a $340 million deal that required the undivided confidence of co-investors, limited partners, lenders, and a seller who had a walk right? Ethan looked at the timeline. He poured himself a glass of the scotch he had bought from a shop on Portobello Road, a 12-year-old expression from a distillery he liked, reasonably priced, not a performance, and sat down at the writing desk and looked at the bare rose hedge in the garden behind the building. He thought about the ring in his jacket pocket, both rings still there. He had not taken them out since Aurelius. At some point he would deal with them. The stones were genuinely valuable, the Antwerp diamond especially, and he was not a man who let genuinely valuable things be wasted through sentiment. But not now. Now he thought about the work. The timeline accelerated on day 12. Meridian Growth Partners formally withdrew from the Vertex North co-investment, citing unresolved due diligence concerns. The withdrawal was not a rejection, exactly. It was the carefully worded language of an institution that had identified a real concern and was not willing to proceed until it was resolved, and that left open the possibility of re-engagement after resolution. But the practical effect, with 21 days remaining until the seller's walk right, was close to a deal-killing problem. Marcus would need to find an $85 million replacement, or restructure the deal's funding architecture, or negotiate an extension with the seller, all of which were possible, and none of which were easy or free of cost. Ethan learned about the withdrawal through a secondary source, a partner at a different private equity fund who had been peripherally involved in the Vertex North process, and who mentioned it in the tone of someone sharing interesting industry gossip during a dinner in London that Ethan had arranged on the pretext of discussing a separate matter. He absorbed the information without reacting to it, and moved the conversation on, and, back in his flat that evening, updated his timeline. Day 15 brought the Section 8.4c letter back to him, not directly, but through a partner at the fund formation firm that had drafted Hale Brennan's latest partnership agreement, who called Ethan to ask if he had any context on a limited partner inquiry that's come through that looks like it might be related to you. Ethan said, with perfect truth, that he had no current engagement with Hale Brennan, and that the inquiry would need to be handled through the fund's own counsel. He wished the attorney well, and hung up. The fund's counsel would investigate. The investigation would require Marcus to produce disclosure documentation. Producing disclosure documentation would require Marcus to acknowledge, in writing, the existence of the financial relationship with Nadia's firm. Acknowledging that relationship would require an explanation. Explanations, in governance contexts, had a way of becoming very expensive. Day 17 brought word from Clara Whitmore that Margaret Hale's attorney had sent a formal letter to the administrator of Harold Hale's closed estate, requesting the production of certain documents. The letter cited the valuation concern and requested the original appraisal reports and comparative market analyses used to establish property value at the time of distribution. This was entirely standard estate litigation procedure, but it required Marcus to engage estate counsel, who would need to review the original documentation, who would likely discover that the original appraisal, conducted by a firm that the estate attorney had recommended, had used comparable sales from a period 12 months prior to the estate's closure, when the market had been softer, rather than the most current comparable data. It was not fraud. It was not even clearly malpractice. The appraisal had been within the standard range of professional practice, if at the conservative end, but it was the kind of thing that, once surfaced, required a settlement conversation if the defending party wanted to avoid the cost and reputational exposure of a trial. Settlement conversations involved money. Day 19. Marcus Hale called 6 times. Day 20. A real estate attorney Ethan did not recognize called and left a message asking if he could discuss a matter of mutual interest relating to a Tribeca commercial property. Ethan did not return that call. Day 21. He received a text from a number he did not have saved, a New York area code, a message that read, "I know what you're doing. We need to talk." He noted the time. He did not respond. Day 22. Nadia's calls had dropped off in the previous week to 1 or 2 a day. Today, there were none. He noted the absence. Day 23. He took a train to Edinburgh for reasons unrelated to the correction. A professional inquiry from a Scottish pension fund that wanted him to consult on a complex restructuring, and spent 2 days in a city he had always found conducive to the specific kind of thinking he needed to do. Edinburgh in November had a quality that matched his current interior state. Beautiful in a gray and structural way, stripped of the decorative softness that warmer climates produced, a place that presented itself without apology in whatever condition the weather had left it. He walked the Royal Mile at 7 a.m. on his second morning, in a drizzle that was not quite rain and not quite mist, passing the closed storefronts and the tourists who had decided that Scottish November weather was not going to defeat them. And he thought about what came next. The correction was proceeding correctly. The 3 threads were creating the compound pressure he had designed them to create. Marcus Hale, in the last 30 days, had gone from a man in the middle of a successful career-defining acquisition to a man dealing simultaneously with a financing crisis, a fund governance inquiry, a potential estate litigation, and the knowledge, and Ethan was certain he had this knowledge, it was impossible not to, that the person responsible for his current situation was someone he had mentored for 6 years, and wronged in a way that could not be called anything other than what it was. None of this was personal. He kept returning to that clarity, because it mattered to him that it not be personal. Not because he was incapable of personal motivations, but because personal motivations produced irregular outcomes, and Ethan had no interest in irregular outcomes. He had built the correction on professional and legal foundations, because those foundations were stable and defensible, and because, ultimately, every single thing he had done was something Marcus Hale's own actions had created the conditions for. He had not invented the valuation concern in the Vertex North deal. He had not invented the Section 8.4C exposure. He had not invented the estate property undervaluation. He had found them, the way a forensic analyst finds the things that were always there, always real, always waiting to be found. Marcus had built the vulnerabilities. Ethan had simply read the marks in the carpet. He was in Edinburgh when the deal died. Not from any of his threads directly. The financing timeline had created enough uncertainty that the seller had decided, with 14 days remaining in the window, that the risk of continuing to hold the property off-market while the deal restructured was not worth the eventual price. They had walked. Vertex North was back on the market. Ethan received this information from the same secondary source who had told him about the Meridian withdrawal, in a message that read, "Heard Hale's deal fell out of bed. Messy timing." He replied, "Too bad. Then he closed his laptop and went to dinner at a restaurant near his hotel that had been recommended by the pension fund's CFO, a small room with close tables and a wood-burning grill in the corner, and a menu that was mostly variations on the proposition that good Scottish ingredients, treated with respect, needed very little elaboration. He ordered the lamb. He ordered a glass of a Burgundy he recognized. He ate alone at a table by the window, looking at the dark street outside, the yellow light of the street lamps in the drizzle. And he allowed himself, for the first time in 33 days, to sit with what had happened. Not the correction, the thing that had made the correction necessary. The dinner at Aurelius. The ring on the white tablecloth. Nadia's hands flat on the linen. 7 months. He ate the lamb. He was very good. He drank the wine slowly. He thought about a night almost exactly 2 years ago, when he and Nadia had been stuck in a power outage in his apartment. A grid failure, something in the substation, the whole block down for 6 hours on a night in January when the temperature outside was 9 degrees. They had eaten dinner by candlelight and played an improvised card game with the rules of which Nadia had made up as she went along, changing them whenever she was losing. And he had let her change them, not because he was being indulgent, but because he had genuinely found the rule-changing more interesting than the game itself. They had talked for 4 hours, about nothing important, about her childhood in Minnesota, and his in a suburb of Boston that he never visited anymore, and the specific way that both of them had grown up in households that were competent and functional and almost completely emotionally sealed. He had told her things he had never told anyone else. He sat with that knowledge in the Edinburgh restaurant and found it did not devastate him the way he had, somewhere in the background of his processing, expected it might. It settled instead like sediment, the slow, heavy descent of something that had been suspended and had now, finally, found its level. He had trusted her. That trust had been misplaced. The misplacement was not a reflection of his judgment in general. His judgment in general was, by most available metrics, quite good, but rather a reflection of the specific and universal human incapacity to apply forensic attention to the things you most do not want to be forensic about. He had analyzed Nadia's behavior over 4 years with a level of attention that most people would describe as excessive. He had noticed things. He had cataloged expressions and gestures and speech patterns, and the 1,000 small signals that constituted, in aggregate, the documentary record of a person's interior life. And he had, because he had wanted to, interpreted them charitably. That was not stupidity. That was the reasonable behavior of a man in love, which was a cognitive state that impaired certain functions even in people who were otherwise extremely good at processing information accurately. He had been in love. He chewed that over, sitting with the remnants of his lamb and the half-glass of Burgundy, and he decided that it was true, and that it was also, in some important and irreducible way, already past tense. He finished the wine. He paid the bill. He walked back to his hotel in the drizzle. In his room, he looked at his phone. Nadia had called once, earlier that evening. He had missed it. He had not declined it. It had rung through while he was ordering dinner. He held the phone for a long time. Then he set it down on the desk and opened his laptop. The correction had one final thread that he had not activated yet. He had identified it in the first week, recognized it immediately as the most consequential element, and deliberately held it in reserve. Not because it was dramatic. It was, in fact, the most procedurally quiet piece of the entire structure, but because it required precision timing, and because deploying it too early would have foreclosed options that he needed to keep open. Marcus Hale, as a managing partner of a registered investment advisor, was subject to the Form ADV disclosure requirements of the Investment Advisors Act of 1940. These disclosures required him to report material changes in his professional and financial circumstances to the SEC within 90 days. Among the things that could constitute a material change was a significant civil litigation matter against the firm or its principals. The estate litigation, still in early stages, still in the document production phase, was not yet at the level of a material litigation. A letter requesting documents was not a filed complaint. But Clara Whitmore had, 11 days ago, indicated that Margaret Hale's position was solid enough that she was preparing to file. When the complaint was filed, the clock on the Form ADV update would begin. A managing partner who failed to update his Form ADV within the required window had an SEC compliance problem. An SEC compliance problem, even an inadvertent one, required disclosure to existing limited partners and could trigger certain consent rights under standard fund agreements. Ethan did not need to do anything about the Form ADV. The regulatory requirement existed independently of him. The clock would start when Clara filed, and Marcus's compliance team would either catch it or they wouldn't. He had, however, thought carefully about whether to send a courtesy notification. Not to Marcus, to his compliance officer, a woman named Bethany Park, who had been the fund's chief compliance officer for 4 years, and who was, by every account Ethan had encountered, scrupulously professional and deeply unhappy in her current role. A compliance officer who received an anonymous tip about an upcoming litigation that might create a Form ADV update requirement would not be legally obligated to investigate. But a conscientious compliance officer, and Bethany Park, by all accounts, was conscientious, would. He drafted the tip. Brief, factual, entirely accurate, citing only public information. The estate attorney letter was a public record once filed with the county court. He looked at it for a long time. Then he sent it. On day 38, he came back to New York. Not because the correction was complete. The threads were still running, would run for months in some cases. But because there was a limit to the productive life of absence, and he had reached it. He had work in New York. He had a practice that needed his attention. He had a life that was going to need to be rebuilt from a different configuration than the one he had been planning. And rebuilding was not something you did from abroad. He stayed in a hotel for the first week, while the apartment situation was resolved. He had arranged to break the lease, an expensive outcome, but the apartment held too many marks, too many depressions in the carpet, and he was not interested in living in a space that would require him to spend energy managing its history. He had a real estate contact who was already finding him something else. The hotel was the same mid-range chain he had stayed in on his first night after leaving Aurelius. He asked for a different room on a different floor, facing a different direction, looking at a different slice of the city. Small adjustments, but he had found over the years that small adjustments mattered. That the cumulative weight of the details you chose to surround yourself with was not nothing, was not the kind of trivial vanity that self-consciously unsentimental people dismissed, but was actually a meaningful input into the quality and character of your thinking. He went back to work. Client meetings, deal reviews, a forensic engagement for a litigation firm that was handling a complex fraud case. He worked with the focused intensity that he always brought to the work, the intensity that had not diminished during the last 38 days, but had, if anything, sharpened, the way a blade sharpens against resistance. He had lunch with Patrick, his assistant, on the third day back. Patrick, who was 26 and relentlessly competent, and had spent 6 weeks managing Ethan's professional absence without asking a single personal question, sat across from him in a diner near the office, the kind of diner where the coffee came in thick ceramic cups, and the booths were covered in red vinyl that was cracked along the seams, and the menu was laminated and 3 pages long, and waited with the precise patience of someone who had learned, in 6 weeks of managing the aftermath, that his employer would provide whatever context he was meant to have and nothing more. Ethan told him that he would be resuming full operations the following Monday. "Good," Patrick said. "There's a lot. Walk me through it." They spent 40 minutes on the backlog. Then Ethan ordered a second cup of the thick diner coffee and looked out the window at the street. Late November, cold. The kind of New York cold that stripped the city of its performative warmth and showed you the structural version underneath. The buildings and the traffic, and the people moving with the heads-down determination of people who had decided that surviving the weather was a non-negotiable personal project, and felt, for the first time in 38 days, something that was approximately its own kind of equilibrium. Not peace, he would not have used that word. More like the feeling of a gyroscope that had been disturbed and was now, through the physics of its own rotation, finding its way back to the vertical. He paid the bill. He and Patrick walked back to the office. Nadia called on his third day back. He watched the phone ring. He had now, in 38 days, received 47 calls from Nadia and 11 from Marcus. He had documented every one. The documentation formed a kind of accidental record, a timeline of someone else's diminishing certainty about whether the person they were trying to reach was ever going to pick up, and of the decisions they had made in the face of that uncertainty. Marcus had given up on day 22. Nadia had not. He answered, not because he had decided to forgive her, not because he was ready for a conversation, but because the absence was finished, and the conversation was going to happen eventually, and Ethan Cole did not postpone inevitable conversations. "You're back," she said. Her voice was quieter than he remembered. Not sad exactly. Something more like still. "Yes." "I've been—" She stopped. "I didn't know where you were." "I know." A long pause. The kind of pause that held a great deal of things that neither of them had language for yet. He was standing at the window of his hotel room, looking down at the street 40 floors below, the small moving figures of people and the yellow stream of taxis, and the gray impassive face of the building across the avenue. And he had the strange, momentary sensation of looking at the city from a height that rendered everything equally small, and therefore equally real. Not diminished, just proportioned correctly. "Are you okay?" she asked. He thought about that question with the same attention he gave every question he was asked, the habit of actually listening to what was being said, rather than preparing his response before the other person had finished. "I'm doing what I'm always doing," he said. She understood what that meant. After 4 years, she understood what that meant. "Marcus lost the deal," she said. "I heard." "Ethan?" Her voice changed, not accusatory, something more careful. "What did you do?" He was quiet for a moment. "Everything I did was legal," he said, "and accurate. I didn't invent a single thing. Everything I surfaced was real." "That's not what I asked." "I know." Another pause. He could hear her breathing, slow and deliberate, the way she breathed when she was managing herself carefully. He had noticed that pattern in their second year together, during a period when her practice had been under significant stress. A difficult client, a contractor dispute, a 6-month period of accumulated pressure that she had handled mostly by becoming very still and very deliberate in her physical presence, as if she could compensate for the disorder outside her by maintaining perfect order inside herself. He understood that impulse. He had lived inside a version of it for 38 days. "I'm not with him anymore," she said. It ended 3 weeks ago. He's not a good person. I understand that now in ways I didn't." "Nadia," he said. She stopped. "I believe you," he said. "And it doesn't matter." The line was quiet for a long time. He could hear, faintly, the sound of traffic from wherever she was, outside maybe, or near a window. The sound of the city continuing to move, regardless of everything. "Okay," she said finally. He stood at his window and thought about all the things he might say. He had thought about this conversation in the abstract many times over the last 38 days, had considered the various forms it might take, and the things she might say, and the things he might say back. He was not a man who did not think about conversations in advance. He had constructed the architecture of hundreds of difficult professional conversations before having them, and the habit was not one he had ever fully switched off. He had not, he found now, actually prepared for this one. He had thought about it without preparing for it, which meant that somewhere underneath the deliberate analytical processing, there had been a part of him that did not want to know, in advance, what he was going to say. "Take care of yourself," he said. He hung up. He sat for a moment with the phone in his hand, looking at the blank screen, and then he set it down and opened the current file on his desk, a forensic review of a technology company's accounts receivable, a clean, technical problem that required only attention and methodology, and he began to read. 2 weeks later, Clara Whitmore filed the complaint in the estate litigation. The complaint was 43 pages and cited, with the methodical clarity that Clara brought to everything, undervaluation of the Reston industrial property, the inadequacy of the original appraisal methodology, and the failure to provide the secondary beneficiary with sufficient independent valuation evidence before the distribution was approved. It named Marcus Hale as the primary respondent and sought damages of approximately $2.4 million, Margaret Hale's share of the difference between the estate property's actual market value and the value at which it had been distributed. It was filed on a Tuesday morning. On Tuesday afternoon, Marcus Hale's compliance officer, Bethany Park, submitted a preliminary Form ADV amendment to the SEC, noting the pending litigation and reserving the right to provide additional detail as the matter developed. On Wednesday, 3 limited partners in Hale Brennan's most recent fund vintage submitted formal requests for information under their information rights provisions. On Thursday, the managing partner of a competing fund that had been in early conversations with Marcus about a potential merger sent a note indicating that those conversations would be paused pending resolution of certain open matters. Ethan read each of these developments through secondary sources, through the institutional grapevine that ran through every industry and that moved information with the efficiency of water finding its level. He did not comment on any of them. He did not reach out to any of the parties. He answered no calls from Marcus and noted, with the same methodical attention, that Marcus had stopped calling after day 44. He thought about Marcus, occasionally, in the intervals between work. He thought about what Marcus's days probably looked like now, the calls to attorneys in 3 different practice areas, the conversations with co-investors and limited partners that required careful calibration of how much to reveal and what to minimize, the background radiation of institutional uncertainty that follows a managing partner. Whenever he walks into a room where the people he needs to keep confident have recently received correspondence from parties they didn't expect. It was not comfortable territory. Ethan knew from professional experience what it cost a person, in time, in attention, in the specific cognitive exhaustion of sustained defensive management, to operate under that kind of compound pressure. The body could handle one threat at a time, could mount a coherent response and direct its resources efficiently. 3 simultaneous threats, each requiring different expertise and different documentation and different interpersonal management, consumed resources at a rate that left almost nothing in reserve for the forward-facing work. Marcus Hale, who had built a career on maintaining the confidence of capital allocators, was now spending most of his available bandwidth on the operational equivalent of bailing water. Ethan found he did not enjoy this thought. He had expected to enjoy it, had anticipated in the analytical corner of his mind that was honest about its own processes, a certain satisfaction in the knowledge that the correction was working as designed. What he found instead was something more neutral, the clean, bloodless recognition of a system operating correctly, the way a well-calibrated instrument produces accurate measurements without comment on what the measurements mean. He moved into a new apartment on a Wednesday, a different neighborhood, higher floor, a different geometry of light and view, a kitchen that had been recently updated with materials that were slightly better than what had been in the old one. He assembled the coffee setup. He seasoned the new cast-iron pan. He hung his grandfather's cufflinks on the hook beside the mirror in the bedroom where he had always hung them. He did not water a plant, because there was no plant. That would come later, he supposed. Or it wouldn't. He was finding that he had less certainty about the decorative architecture of his future self than he had expected, and that this lack of certainty was not the distressing thing it would have once seemed. It was, instead, just a space. A room with the lights off, whose shape he didn't yet know. He would find out when he turned on the lights. 3 months after the dinner at Aurelius, the estate litigation settled. Not for the full $2.4 million. These things never settled for the full demand, and Ethan had not expected otherwise. It settled for $1.1 million, paid from Marcus Hale's personal account to Margaret Hale's estate trust. Marcus's attorneys issued a statement characterizing it as a resolution in the interest of finality that does not constitute an admission of wrongdoing. Margaret Hale donated $200,000 of the settlement to a music scholarship fund at the Connecticut college where she had taught for 22 years, a fact that Ethan encountered incidentally in a local Connecticut newspaper that ran a small item about them. Donation. He read the item twice. Then he closed the browser. The Section 8.4c inquiry at Hale Brennan was ultimately resolved. Marcus's counsel produced documentation that, while confirming the financial relationship with Nadia's firm, argued successfully that the relationship did not rise to the level of a conflict requiring prior disclosure. The inquiry was closed with a consent to enhanced disclosure procedures going forward. It cost Marcus approximately $280,000 in legal fees. The Vertex North deal was acquired 6 weeks later by a different buyer at a price that was slightly lower than what Marcus had agreed to pay, a fact that was generally attributed in the industry to the seller's decision to sell quickly after the previous deal fell apart, and not to any of the due diligence concerns that Philip O'Sea's team had raised. Ethan read the acquisition announcement on a Friday afternoon in his new apartment, sitting at the desk with a cup of coffee that was, he thought, the best he had calibrated the new setup to produce. Outside, the city was doing what it did on Friday afternoons in February, moving with a kind of collective, tired urgency, everyone heading somewhere with the accelerated determination of people who had been waiting all week to leave wherever they currently were. He had, in the 3 months since Aurelius, spent approximately $83,000. The Delaware entity's retainer to Jerome Pacheco, Clara Whitmore's engagement, which was modest given that she had characterized this as the repayment of a professional debt, the secondary limited partner interest acquisition, the most substantial cost, the 2 rings, the broken lease, the Singapore hotel, the London flat, the Edinburgh nights, the flights, the food, the cab to Changi Airport at 8 p.m. on a night when the city smelled like rain and warm asphalt, and the taxi driver had played a radio station broadcasting what sounded like a very old Cantonese opera that Ethan had found, in the specific way of very good music encountered in unexpected circumstances, genuinely moving. Against that $83,000, he had no direct financial recovery. He was not a plaintiff in the estate litigation. That recovery went to Margaret Hale, who deserved it. He had no claim against Hale Brennan. He had received no payment and sought none. The return on his investment was, by conventional measure, negative. He finished the coffee. He opened his phone. 47 calls from Nadia, 11 from Marcus. All documented, all declined. He went to the contact for Nadia and deleted the photo, the one from Lisbon, the cafe, the afternoon light, and replaced it with the default gray silhouette. Then he put the phone in his pocket. He took the 2 rings from the small ceramic dish on his desk where they had lived since he returned to New York. The Antwerp diamond, the one he had never taken out at the restaurant. He held them both for a moment, feeling their weight. They were lighter than the significance attached to them, as objects almost always were. He put them in an envelope. He addressed the envelope to a dealer in antique and estate jewelry on 47th Street, who had a reputation for both discretion and accuracy, and with whom he had done business twice before. He included a brief note explaining that the pieces were estate items, no provenance issues, and requesting a valuation. He sealed the envelope. He went out into the cold February afternoon and mailed it. He did not look back at the building. On the street, his phone buzzed. Not a call, a text, from a number he didn't have saved. He opened it. It was from Philip Osei. About that conversation in Singapore. Are you free next week? I have something that might be interesting to you. Ethan read the message twice. He typed back, Tuesday works. He put his phone in his pocket and walked into the city.